Tales of the Solar Convergence, Chapter 1. Emerson leaned against the heavy glass of the great window. She often came here to lean in a reversed arch posture, and let the great domed top of the Hagia Sophia show her the wonders of the skyline. She often came here to think. There had been a lot to think about these last 2 years. Em focused out over the skyline and beyond the ghostly reflection of her own pale skin in the glass. She shook her head gently to coerce the bangs of her short black hair to one side and briefly admired how the reflection of her blue eyes nearly matched the sky above at this hour of the day. From this, the highest point in Constantinople, she could take in the beauty of the city and look backward to her past with a view of the license zone there in the distance. The license zone. Sometimes she actually missed it. More accurately, Em missed what she had lost there, what she had left, her parents. Emerson often came here, but today was special. It was the anniversary. Today was the anniversary being celebrated all over. 127 years ago, this very day, Terrans had made first contact with the people of Puxaswitney. Soon after that, they had met the people of Keltechia. Then, the rogue energy wave that destroyed much of this part of the galaxy had brought the last of the Pux and the Keltech into the Sol system for refuge. With great, hopeful optimism, Terrans had welcomed the aliens to converge in the solar system. But in those early years, great change had led to great distress. For their part, the Pux, who had taken up living on Mars and renamed it Puxaswitney for their homeworld, had only been trying to be helpful. It was with the best of intentions that they had introduced their genetically engineered food and fabric trees to Terra, to sprout their endless supply of food and clothing under the shelter of the great canopies. Poverty simply disappeared in the wave of cheap energy and the technology to produce. The basic needs of everyone were met easily. So also, the technology introduced by the Pux and Keltech, electronic gadgets made by other electronic gadgets, provided all the comforts of life with virtually no work required. And there had been the crux of the disaster. Terrans no longer needed to work to meet their basic needs. With great optimism, the nations of Terra had naively joined together into a new super government structure with the alien newcomers. They called it the Solar Convergence. Their hope had been to promote learning and art, personal growth along with science, spirituality plus exploration of the universe, to keep us all busy, finding new ways to find new meaning. But the majority of the human race rejected these notions. Most people wanted nothing more than to frivolously fritter their lives away on sex and drugs, leisure and self-indulgence. A radical few preached war and uprising against the convergence, claiming that it was communism. A radical few others preached war and uprising against the convergence because they said it was fascist. They couldn't even seem to define what it was they hated so much about the solar convergence and the new way of life. They just rejected it. Amid the riots and anarchy of the uprising, the nuclear wastes, the war, the struggle, the blood, the convergence had simply withdrawn and retreated. Their first principle had become to accept people as they were and not to interfere in their personal choices. Hence, the convergence simply fenced off that part of the world where they were still welcome. It encompassed Florida, across much of Africa, where many of the reptilian Keltech now lived, up through the Holy Land to Constantinople. The rest of the surface of Terra was now the license zone, where the bulk of humanity lived in depraved licentiousness. But sometimes there were a few who defected, who survived the melee and came across and joined the convergence. Emerson was one of them. She had been born in the zone, but her parents had quietly given her books to read and encouraged her. They were fearful of ever leaving the zone and the life that they had there, but clearly they intended that someday Emerson might leave for a new life on the other side. Em had returned from the ruins of the old library in town one night to find them, her parents, had been used and murdered by one of the roving rape gangs that littered the zone. They were dead, and left in a state far worse than just dead. She remembered that night so vividly. She was sure she always would. Those things don't leave your mind, the image of them or the feeling. And so she had fled and ran, just fled and ran and run and ran some more, and she hadn't even cried until after she defected. Beyond the welcoming guards and just inside the mighty walls into the solar convergence, into Constantinople, she had collapsed and wept. Now, looking out over the scene from the top of the Hagia Sophia just 2 years later, a single tear made its way down her cheek. "I finally finished my education, Mom," she whispered out loud. "I've really made a life for myself here that you'd be proud of, Dad." This was Emerson's life in the year 127 SC, 127 years since Convergence. Chapter 2. From a high window amid the skyscrapers of Constantinople, Rick looked out over the skyline. Not too far away, he could make out the figure of a young girl leaning into a curved window at the highest point of the Hagia Sophia's new dome. Even after 2 years of getting to know her, of helping her get to know modern life in the solar convergence, Rick still worried about her sometimes. She's very young. Jin's voice brought Rick's mind back to where it was. Without turning his gaze off the girl in the distance, he responded to his Caltech friend who had stopped by. "I was young once, a long time ago." "You're not a day over 25, Jin's right head declared, while the left snickered and added, "Physically, anyway." It was true, of course. The technological miracle of the gel was extending life for all the species of the convergence, but Rick was still exceptional. He had been 102 years old when the gel had been entering its experimental phase. He was the guy who had nothing to lose and volunteered. That was 100 years ago now. Rick was a living relic, the last living human to actually remember things like the Cold War and disco and 8-track tape players. Rick chuckled to himself. He was the best preserved fossil of human history. The gel had been truly a miraculous discovery, combining Caltech microtech implants and the Pux's genetically engineered soup, which served as their only sustenance. Terrans had developed the gelatinous electrochemical liquid, the gel for short. And it was, well, a gel, filled with billions and trillions of unknown quantities of microscopic machines and single-celled organisms. Some of the atom-sized machines built other atom-sized machines. Some kept the arteries clean. Some made stem cells from the biomatter in the soup to reinforce and heal pretty much anything in the body to give it anything it needed. The gel even fed the body too, producing nutrients from various forms of genetically engineered green algae that gave the gel its nearly glowing green color. The gel could also be controlled by electronic impulses and commanded to take different shapes to change density. In emergencies, large quantities of it could be ejected from reservoirs to cover cities, ships, people with a protective layer. It could even be a weapon in extreme emergencies, shaping and forming into things which could reach out beyond the shields and shove enemies away. There were only 2 catches when it came to the gel. Humans only consumed other forms of food for fun, and on rare occasions now, and Rick really missed tacos, and for all its technological perfection, the gel did not need anything but new biomatter added to it from time to time to keep it running. Luckily, the Terrans still had plenty of cows around and milk to dump into the mixture. I guess, temporally speaking, You're old enough to be, Rick cut Jin off. Please spare me your brilliant mathematical calculations of how many greats I'd need to be M's grandfather. Jin smiled wryly with one hand, while the other nodded and chuckled. Rick chuckled too. The two men headed out of the chamber and down the hall to check on the others. Chapter 3. The doors to the classroom slid open with a whisper and Rick and Jin stepped inside. One whole wall of the room was a large touchscreen. Scribbling on it with his finger, Operations Specialist Jehoiakim was whispering to himself. Rick and Jin joined Pastor Ix, fleet chaplain, in watching the spectacle. Ix was a Pux. The people of Puxaswitney had always lived underground in the darkness of the dirt. But long ago they had developed a thriving culture that lived on the surface. It had begun with experimental probes controlled from under the soil and evolved into a species-wide community of living out their lives through puppets which jutted up from the dirt. Pastor Ix, like all the Pucks living among Terrans and the Keltec, went about his day in what was basically a metal box of dirt with wheels about 5 feet by 5 feet. The little Pucks would curl up inside out of sight in his natural habitat of the soil, while the puppet persona, specific to each Puck, stuck up out of the dirt and became their sole contact with others. It always struck Rick to be reminiscent of a planter with flowers growing up out of it, except the Pucks were much more mobile and intelligent. Pastor Ix's puppet self was generically humanoid in appearance, but displaying gray, rubbery skin. He was always dressed in the black pants and black clerical shirt with the white tab that indicated he was a pastor. The tab shirts had come in and out of fashion for Lutherans, but were solidly in style for the last 100 years or so. That made Rick, a relatively old-fashioned Lutheran himself, happy. He liked seeing clerical collars. It reminded him of his youth, a few centuries plus ago. Jehoiakim is working out calculations that are, well, as usual, beyond my comprehension, Pastor Ix pointed out quietly. Something to do with charting the ship's course and the likelihood of finding life. He's turned his fret off again, too, Rick observed. Jin shook both heads gently. I'm not sure that's good for him. Every person in the Convergence, besides the gel, also had a Fred, which was short for Fraternal Electronic Device. Freds were worn, usually on the left forearm and linked wirelessly to the small backpack affixed across the shoulders. The Fred gave immediate access to the internet through the touchscreen on the forearm panel and also monitored and controlled the gel that they had inside their bodies in case the wearer needed something specific. The backpack also unfolded to deploy a small seat. And sometimes you could even literally fly around because of its anti-gravity properties. But there were cases where Freds were specially designed to do even more. Jehoiakim, for example, had been orphaned in the license zone, abandoned by his parents. He had stumbled his way across the border and into the Convergence when he was very young. They quickly discovered that he was very autistic and variously scarred from something never seen anymore in those born inside the Convergence. Jehoiakim had fetal alcohol syndrome. The Fred allowed Jehoiakim to function, well, normally by everyone else's view, filling in the gaps in his synapses and nervous system. He variously both loved and hated his Fred. It was nice to be normal, whatever that meant these days. On the other hand, Jehoiakim liked to turn it off fairly often and remember what it felt like to be himself, or at least the Jehoiakim he remembered being as a child. A flurry of finger dancing across the screen, and Jehoiakim trembled a bit and started sweating slightly. Life, he said spasmodically. Life. There. He pointed. The undoubtedly brilliant computations meant nothing to Rick, Jin, and Ix. It was all over their collective heads. That's good, Jehoiakim. Rick internally smacked himself for sounding patronizing. Will the computer be able to understand all this when we board the ship? I sure don't. Jehoiakim sensed Rick's internal smacking of himself and giggled. Okay, he said. Great. Jin began to say something but couldn't get it out. Jehoiakim smiled over at them and danced his fingers over the forearm display of his Fred. A small burst of energy emanated through him. Yes, I know. The now perfectly smooth Jehoiakim smiled. It's time to turn the Fred back on. Make sure you download your computations too, Rick instructed. We'll take them to the ship when we board. Jehoiakim nodded. Rick was suddenly distracted and started looking around. Wait a minute. I thought you were watching Memo. No worries, Jehoiakim retorted. I left him in good hands. Pastor Ix grabbed Rick's shoulder and nodded. He wanted to go with Taj to visit the bovines. Chapter 4. Taj ran her fingers through her long dark hair. Her green eyes glistened under the radiance of the sun. The little furry snake-like slar curled up around her arm just above her Fred across the panel. Taj needed to be careful. She was going to get attached to Rick's little companion. She needed to adopt one of her own. Memo hissed out, Lovely day. Yes, Taj smiled. Yes, it is. The slar had been genetically engineered by the Keltec centuries ago after a plague obliterated the only creatures they had kept as pets. The furry little snakes were soft and pleasant to pet. They slithered about, using the fur as their appendages. Not quite sentient, yet far more intelligent than any pet Terrans had ever kept. The slar were engineered from the beginning for companionship. Their unusually large eyes and mouth, with their little tongue hanging out from time to time, made them look cartoonish, like the animation of a bygone era. They ate very little, and the only waste they produced emanated from their bodies as a type of vaporous humidity, with minerals gaseous that just smelled like peaty or mossy with just a touch of lilac. But then Taj hadn't come here to ponder the slar. She was carefully watching the bovine habitat from the fence row. Taj wasn't sure what she found so fascinating about the cows. There was more than one possibility. On one hand, Terrans had bred these creatures for millennia, but didn't realize just how intelligent they were until the Keltec and Pux had finally arrived and broke their silence on the matter. Those two species had made direct contact with cows before they had humans. The language was difficult to translate because apparently cows had a very, very odd pattern of thought, a very different way of perceiving the universe, which would explain why humans hadn't recognized their intelligence at all until they were told. On the other hand, even though her parents weren't particularly religious, Taj had grown up with her grandmother's tales of Hinduism. The cow was sacred to them. Given everything the Terrans now knew about the bovine mind, Taj couldn't help but wonder at what ancient wisdom was stored up in those oddly ordered synapses that perhaps her remote ancestors had somehow sensed or detected. One of the cows looked over at her and seemed to smile. Does it know what I'm thinking? She wondered. Just then her Fred chimed in that a call was. Memo compulsively pushed the answer icon for her with his nose, then jerked back into a humorous position that quietly said, Oops, I'm sorry, I wasn't supposed to do that. Taj chuckled. Taj here. It's Rick. The specialist's voice came through the Fred, along with the image of him walking down a corridor with Jehoiakim, Ix, and Jin. We have a date, Taj. Need to start gathering. Taj nodded to the screen. I'll see you at Bryn shortly, boss. Chapter 5. Emerson watched the final incense dancing its way past the icons and around the sanctuary. Making the sign of the cross, she turned, made her way down the aisle to meet the priest. His long white beard was so interwoven with the remaining incense that he exuded a powerful mysticism as he shook her hand and they exchanged blessings. Outside in the daylight, Em reactivated her Fred and realized the time. Stepping away from the gathering of the faithful outside the Hagia Sophia, she activated the travel function. Her Fred more or less scooped her up on the seat, and deploying its armrest wrapped around her, and deploying the anti-gravity, she floated upwards, ascending like incense into the heavens at the end of the Mass. Emerson looked up at the large floating sphere of the transport center hanging in the sky over Constantinople. Navigating her way up and entering one of the large open ports, She softly came down as her Fred folded back behind her and her feet touched the deck. Em looked around and saw her crewmate Taj also coming to a stop, with Rick's Slar memo wrapped around her neck and his usual exaggerated look of fear exuding. He just didn't enjoy the free flight that the Fred devices provided. Emerson smiled and called to them, "Taj!" Memo loosened himself and returned to coiling gently around Taj's bicep just above her Fred panel as she waved Em over and they began walking together. Was it a beautiful liturgy? Always is, Em confirmed, then added, "How are the cows?" Taj wasn't sure. She never was. A slightly distressed look hidden behind a smile crawled across her dark complexion. "How are they? They're fascinating." Down the corridor, they stopped at one of the travel pod excess chambers. As they stepped close to the rounded indentation, Em was struck that it resembled the dome of a church. Funny, she had never noticed that before. As if out of nowhere, the seats deployed quickly up from the floor. The man at the control panel asked their destination as they sat down. Bryn Station. A mere seconds after Taj had named the location, the indentation formed into the complete dome, into the pod, to the complete sphere, and snapped shut. At incredible velocity, they sped upwards to space, protected by the inertial countering effects of the energy waves that washed over them by the gel. So precise was the technology of the waves and the gel that they felt like they were sitting still. It only took several seconds for the pod to dock and unsnap into a half dome, leaving them in a travel pod chamber on Bryn Station. "Welcome to Bryn Gustafson," the man at the control panel declared. The station was very impressive. As Taj and Memo strode beside her down the corridor, Em found that she still marveled at the miraculous structure. For quite some time, the solar convergence had stopped manned space exploration, and it was very disappointing to many. But contact with the Pux and the Caltech had revealed that they were all that there was of intelligent life in a whole third of the galaxy. This part of the Milky Way was primarily empty, and the rest of the galaxy was too far away. Then the Convergence had discovered an anomaly in space, a wormhole of sorts, a rift, that opened to the opposite side of the galactic core. The now legendary Captain Bryn Gustafson had commanded the first ship through. By the time of her death, a great many worlds had been explored and her ship returned safely to the Sol system. Then, without warning, the anomaly became unstable and the entrance collapsed. Using every bit of technological power they could muster, the Convergence discovered a way to open this side of the anomaly again. And they did it more conveniently, with the entrance right here near Terra. Due to unforeseen complications, the process worked out, well, less successfully than planned. The quantum bridge between this side of the galaxy and the other did open, and it was stabilized, and it is permanent. However, it was only about 10 feet in diameter. By the time it was completed, having mustered all the energies that they could, the process was done, and they got 10 feet in diameter. There really weren't any ships that could enter. The Solar Convergence then set about building 2 space stations, one on this side of the anomaly and one on the other. They had pushed and pulled and pushed and pulled raw materials, personnel, through in small enough bits with great consistency, persistence, and determination. In the end, they named the station for the legendary explorer Bryn Gustafson Station. Bryn Station was near Earth. About 200-foot-long elevator shaft connected it to Gustafson, the second half of the station on the other side of the galaxy. No sooner had Emerson finished reprocessing all this information in her mind, and the elevator door slid shut. She was on her way, with Taj and Memo, to catch up with her other crewmates who were already gone, completely to the other side of the galaxy by zipping up the elevator. Rick smiled widely as he stepped off onto Bryn Station. "You remember her fondly every time, don't you?" "I loved her," Rick smiled back at Pastor Ix. "I believe the word is platonic?" Jin smiled with both faces. I was in my 80s then, and she was a deaconess working for the church, Rick reminded them. I loved and admired her. Oddly enough, I was one of the people she visited who were near death. Jehoiakim inquired. You were a shut-in? Rick sighed. Yes, a part of history I'd almost forgotten. Rick gestured, and the strange menagerie of his crew followed along towards the elevator through the anomaly and the Gustafson side of the station. Time is alive, Jehoiakim said, just randomly. He whispered to himself, interesting notion, but how would one kill it, and why? Chapter 6. Rick leaned against the glass of the large arched window, almost as he had seen Emerson doing atop the Hagia Sophia. He gazed out onto the ship. After much discussion and debate, it had been decided that this ship should have no formal-sounding registry number, no prefix resembling USS and HMS of Terran ages past would adorn her hull. After all, military ranking systems were now abandoned, along with the practice salutes that were staples of earlier epochs of even space exploration. Even the uniforms that Convergence citizens wore for official duties were built for comfort and unadorned except for different colors to denote specialties in vocation. The loose-fitting clothing stretched over the whole body like a single piece, shoes and all sewn in. Except for the footwear, they reminded Rick of the scrubs worn by hospital workers a few centuries back. Rick liked that. The reminiscence kept him mindful that their work was humanitarian and scientific. His specialties made him captain of this fine new ship, but it was a community of hopeful optimism and open-mindedness. To the best of their ability, Terrans were slipping steadily away from the brute militarism that had marred so much of their past. The ship floated in space, denoting gentle aspirations of its body and soul, with a single word emblazoned across its hull, opposite sides and upper and lower halves of the sphere: liberty. Several smaller ships were already on short missions of mapping here and on the far side of the galaxy, each one named for an ideal, a principle, a historical example, or a previous ship. Columbia, Freedom, Challenger, Endeavor, Preservation, Spirit, Serenity, and Enterprise. Now Liberty, the largest yet, with a crew 600 strong, was preparing to launch into the great unknown of the galaxy. As she gently floated another turn, Rick smiled at the dual-arced and swept-wing configuration, each jutting out centrally and adjacently to one another on opposite sides of the sphere. Each wing was holding one of the two vortex drive engines that would open the quantum slipstream and carry them beyond the speed limits of ancient physics. In the central part of each tubular drive spun the fan blades that regulated the fluid vortex. Taken together, it looked like the wings of an ancient propeller plane, which only Rick could remember seeing with his own eyes, a fact that tickled him endlessly. Big propeller plane wings stuck to a ball. Rick removed himself from the window and straightened his uniform. A short walk to the travel pod chamber, and a few seconds later, he arrived back at his new home aboard the Liberty. He stepped into the elevator and pushed the control panel. With a rapid whisper, it tubed him up to the command deck, and the doors whipped open. Memo hissed out, "Specialist afoot." All heeded Memo's exaggerated proclamation and grinned as they turned. "We're at maximum power," Emerson relayed to Rick. "All's well for launch." The command deck was round with a domed ceiling. 4 doors opened into her, evenly spaced around, splitting the chamber into 4 walls. Upon each wall was a large screen displaying images of the exterior, the interior of Liberty, the various areas dedicated to internal operations, external operations, ongoing research, etc. A few feet away from each screen, a comfortable chair was mounted for the command center personnel on duty, and in the very center of it all was a slightly larger, slightly more comfortable seat for the senior duty officer. Rick made his way to the center seat and slid in. Around him, Jin, Emerson, Taj, Jehoiakim took their seats and interfaced their Freds with Liberty's internal computer. Pastor Ix wheeled over to Rick's right and patted his shoulder with his puppet hand. I'll be down in the Puck's habitat getting a good stretch and some replenished soil. The pastor wheeled to the elevator and tubed away as Rick's fingers ceased dancing on his Fred, and a visual image of First Secretary Reagan of the Exploration Division emerged on one of the large command center screens. "Liberty is all systems go," Rick relayed. The First Secretary seemed perplexed by the call as she quickly pushed her red hair to one side of her face and said, "Well, then go," she smiled. "See what's out there." The image of the First Secretary faded and Rick turned to his seat a full 360-degree turn to smile over the whole command center. "Anchors away," he prodded. "Hoist the sails." Jin snickered and shook both heads as he entered the commands. The large blades of the engines spun rapidly. They formed a tornado-like vortex on each side of energy. The energy gathered together, pooling underneath the ship, streaming suddenly forward with great force. The bottom of the central sphere of Liberty touched the stream, and almost with an image of a splash of water, she disappeared into space in the twinkling of an eye. Chapter 7. Liberty emerged from the slipstream, still flickering with energy all around her. The great fans of the vortex drive came slowly to a complete stop before beginning the small, short bursts of spinning that propelled the vessel below slipstream velocity. Liberty lurched forward, a small metallic object floating in the vast area of space in between stars. A travel pod darted out from the ship. Still opened in its half-domed shape, it quickly scooped up the object, then closed into saucer-esque completion, then darted back. Inside the pod chamber on the ship, as the bulkhead snapped shut behind, and the spinning of the fan blades in the twin engines resumed, and in seconds, Liberty was back in the slipstream, darting quickly away. "Understood," Rick moaned out in response to the early morning call from command deck. He quickly brushed his teeth and washed up, then spoke to his Fred. Still sitting on the nightstand as he pulled on his dark blue uniform. "Note, date, and time. We've been underway approximately 49 hours. Ship and crew have functioned precisely as hoped thus far. Have been summoned to CD to receive report on as yet unknown issue. More later." Rick shifted the Fred backpack onto his uniform into a more comfortable position and slid the panel over his hand and onto his left forearm, out the automatic doors to the elevator tube system. He was off to command deck. As Rick stepped into the command deck, Jin greeted him without looking his way with either of his heads. Jin's pet Slar, Fog, was curled up around his neck, also watching the large screen intently. Fog's face slightly getting in his way, Jin gently pushed the little guy's head aside. Rick stepped towards the center seat to see Memo had gotten there before him. "I believe you have my chair?" Memo frowned an exaggerated sad face with his snout. "We have a situation here," Rick quipped. "You and Fog go play by the bovine habitat for a while." The two little Slar quickly slithered away through a small opening in the wall that was meant for them, custom built throughout the ship. "Now tell me something," Rick insisted to Jin, wasting no more time. "What's up?" One of Jin's heads spun almost completely around to face Rick. "We detected a small metallic object along our slipstream course. I dropped down to standard velocity for a brief period, quickly identified it as the black box from one of our old deep space satellites." "Out here in the void?" Rick was incredulous. "Where did it come from?" "According to the data I have so far examined from it, from the satellite we left in orbit near Samoranai by Captain Gustafsson decades ago. We used that satellite as a relay for long-distance communication with the snow." Rick's tone already indicated the question was coming next. "What happened to it? Why is it out here?" "The data indicates that it was struck by an asteroid and had only seconds to jettison the black box." Jin was still speaking when Emerson, who was also examining the data, interjected. "But check this out." Jin and Rick turned towards the large screen in front of M, where she was magnifying an image. The last picture the satellite snapped and stored in the box before jettison. They weren't sure what they were seeing. Something else orbiting Samoranai. Was it a ship? It was very boxy, khaki-colored. The lines of the boxes lumped together and were ill-defined, like wet cardboard strewn together in a makeshift village in ancient shanty towns. Yet it was clearly metallic. It struck Rick as something like the organic-looking boxy structures of old European neighborhoods on narrow and winding streets. Emerson drew her finger across her Fred screen, and a line with an arrow appeared on the larger interface. Going downward from the unidentified craft, she carefully pointed out what looked like an impact of sorts on the surface of Samoranai. An attack! Rick was horrified. Jehoiakim had been silently observing it from the seat in the command deck circle. Who would attack the snow? He interjected. It's never hurt anybody. I mean, they haven't. Whatever. I tried to signal the snow, Jen reported, but without our satellite as a point of reference and relay, we can probably slipstream there ahead of our own message. Set course for Samoranai, Rick barely managed more than a whisper. I did that 10 minutes ago, Jehoiakim reported. We can actually begin exiting the slipstream in 5, 4, 3. The snow of Samoranai was unique among all life forms yet discovered. The cell walls that kept life here intact on the molecular level were actually made from ice. Each cell had to be preserved at the perfect temperature, just hovering on the freezing point of water. No one was sure how such a thing could be. For their part, the snow believed that it was created by something that their god had done. The snow was alive, and it appeared to be one huge, layered organism covering the perpetually light part of the planet Samoranai. Yet it also displayed multiple intelligences and could change shape into various and independent entities and forms. No one was sure yet whether the snow was an individual or a race. It didn't seem to matter to the snow, which was perpetually confused by the question when asked. When Bryn Gustafson's ship had visited here, they might never have known there was life at all on Samoranai. But as they passed by the perpetually dark side of the planet, they were able to see artificial habitat being constructed, because the snow was spreading out. It was doing its own exploration and colonization in a sense. It was creating a livable habitat for itself on the dark side of the planet, displaying intelligence. When the first astronauts had gone down to see who was building the structure, finding no one that they could identify, it was quite a shock to discover that the snow itself was the builder, that it was alive. Now it looked like they were under attack by an unknown force. As Liberty splashed out of the slipstream, an image of the planet danced across one of the large CD screens. Most of the artificial construction on the dark side of the planet had collapsed under previous assaults. My God! Rick and the whole command crew were aghast. Activate the Fred for translation. He had a sickening look on his face. Try to contact the snow. A flickering signal appeared on the screen, and a frozen white background emerged. Please don't. The tone was fearful and sad. Please don't be hurting me. This is the Convergence vessel Liberty, Rick declared. We picked up our relay beacon deep in space, and the snow ignored him and continued. We don't mean harm. We stay out of way. Please, Terrans, promise, please. Don't harm us. Don't harm anymore. Some of me is now dead. It wasn't us, Rick tried to explain. We came to help. The snow on the screen flickered silently for several seconds. But Terrans attacked us. We thought you were friends. The signal cut off. The signal's turned off at the source, sir, Emerson explained. They no longer want to talk. They're confused, Jehoiakim interjected. Rick leaned back in his chair slightly. So am I. Start scanning for the vessel that attacked them. We need some answers. Chapter 8. Tremors rocked Liberty as the large rocky projectiles impacted on her hull. Report! Report! Rick's voice erupted across the noise of the command deck. They were hiding behind the second moon, Emerson said, to take us by surprise. Then she blushed a little. Everything she had said was already obvious. She knew that Rick needed more information than that. The gel will not deploy, Jehoiakim relayed clearly. They have plugged the vents in the outer hull with these rocks. It was a trap all along. That was now painfully obvious. Whatever the identity of the enemy, they had studied all the data in the Convergence satellite before bombarding the snow, before bombarding the surface of Samoranai, before attacking the satellite. They let the black box get away, Rick said, so it would draw a response, so it would draw a ship here like us. The boxy, khaki-colored craft had pounced out from behind the second moon quickly. It had incredibly powerful, immeasurably huge chains pulling slings attached to its aft section. Apparently, they scooped up rocks in space and used them as weapons. The whole thing seemed rather low-tech, except for the great precision at which they were apparently able to hurl them. They're launching something different, Jin translated his scanner's data. Projectile shape, but he paused for more data. It's hollow. I'm detecting heartbeats inside. Rick spun in the center seat. Taj, signal your defense team. Everyone on the command deck paused to look up from their Fred panels for a split second. The reality had set in. They were being boarded. Rick danced his fingers across his Fred panel. His voice then echoed through the ship. We are being boarded by hostiles. This is not a drill. We are being boarded by hostile forces. Taj exited the command deck, rapidly tubing to meet the new members of her defense team. They were not numerous by any means, just Taj and 4 other crew members. Then again, the ship wasn't meant for combat, so they didn't carry a lot of combat-ready troops. Nevertheless, it was prudent to have a specialist for tactical situations, like Taj on board, and other crew members who were trained in various martial arts and weaponry to practice as a team. Section 10. A voice from command deck Taj couldn't quite identify, relayed through her Fred. It's about to puncture. The voice was cut short by the impact as the projectile-shaped craft punctured the hull. Taj turned the corner and her team wasn't there yet. There was a sudden flash of heat. The voice of Jin from command deck was now clear. I think they sealed the leak they created right after impact. They're designed for boarding like this, Taj yelled back the obvious as the door slid open to Section 10, the bovine habitat. Taj practically burst with energy into the interior as the green glow of the gel inside her body began oozing out to cover her. Just as it could do for ships, even cities, the gel they consumed every day would be brought to the outside of the body for defense. Inside the bovine habitat, she spotted several intruders who were strangely reminiscent of chimpanzees from Terfensian. 3 of them had Terrans slung over their shoulders and were carrying them into the intruding vessel, even as it struck halfway into Liberty's hull. They killed them, the voice of the agriculture expert called out. They didn't have time to defend themselves. 2 of the chimps leapt an incredible distance and fell on Taj. She barely budged as the gel fortified her form. They quickly tumbled away and regained their footing. One of the chimps turned to glare at her with its deep blue eyes. There was something strange about them. Then it called out something in a language Taj couldn't understand, and all the chimps leapt back to their ship with incredible speed. There would be no catching them. Taj knew that. The ag personnel were already clearing the bovines into the next chamber. As the chimp ship pulled away, Taj shoved her gel off her body and formed it into a patch to cover the hole in space. She kept the void out for a few seconds, until one of the hull's emergency patches slid over to cover it and tightened down. All around, sparks and the flashing of lights indicated just how shook up Liberty's systems were, as Taj gently pulled the gel back into her own body. On the command deck, Rick shook his head at the report. They took 3 bodies, corpses. Killed our people and took bodies complete with Fred devices and the gel inside. Jin nodded with both heads. They got the jump on us all right, but clearly their technology isn't up to our level. Yes, that's what they're after. The realization struck Emerson. They came for samples and now they've got it. Signal the enemy ship that we want a truce, Rick instructed. Jehoiakim hesitated. They'll be signaling us now any second anyway, Rick explained. Jehoiakim turned back towards his panel and confirmed. The enemy ship is signaling. Fred has identified the language. It's Russian. Rick was visibly confused as the image of a dark-haired man appeared on the screen in the command deck. He was in his middle 40s, perhaps, sporting a black beard and a bland khaki-colored uniform of some sort. I am People's Colonel Comrade Alexei, the voice came through the translator, representing the people of the Soviet Union. Rick was aghast. Chapter 9. In the bovine habitat, the eldest cow, Blanche, mooed to the two small slar who had been in the habitat since before the attack. Getting the attention of Fogg and Memo, she gestured to the Fred bovine helmet chamber. She wants to talk, Memo hissed out. Let me help. Fogg stretched himself up against the wall and giggled a bit as Memo's fur and his intermingled. Memo crawled up and stretched out. I didn't mean to tickle you. Together they were able to reach and switch open the chamber door. Blanche slid her head into the helmet and immediately called out to the ag specialist. Farmer! Farmer! The ag specialist stepped over to see her. You need to stay on that side of the plexi, he explained, in case the emergency patch gives out. The patch needs to give out, Blanche explained, and pointed with her snout to the large bulk tank of milk in the corner of Section 10. This got the ag specialist's attention. He stammered, What are you thinking? They couldn't have boarded this ship unless our external gel was cut off. Blanche had arrived at the obvious. But the bulk tank empties into the gel to fortify the nutrients. The ag specialist was struck by the brilliance of it, and his eyes grew big. Well, most of our systems are down, though, he explained. How will we remove the emergency patch? I can do it, Blanche said flatly. The whole ship is at risk. On command deck, Rick was staring out at something he never thought he'd see again. A Soviet threat. I'll put it plainly, Colonel Alexei began. Rick cut him off. No, I will. You want our technology, obviously. Also, you know that you can't take the ship by boarding her, hence your hit-and-run raid. Man to man, you are no match for us with our Fed and gel technologies. Colonel Alexei smiled and nodded as Rick went on. On the other hand, you have rendered our ship temporarily helpless and can destroy us outright if we don't deliver you more data to help you develop the technology already in the 3 crew members you murdered and stole. Colonel Alexei smiled broadly. When can we expect delivery of your computer cores? That will take some time, Rick bluffed. About an hour to disconnect them for transport. You have no more than 30 minutes, the colonel chuckled. We will be watching very closely. Don't do anything foolish, like try to unplug your gel vents. I have almost 600 people aboard Liberty, Rick assured. I wouldn't put them all at risk. As soon as the screen flickered and the transmission was off, Rick announced to the command deck, we have 30 minutes. We need defensive options. Jehoiakim turned. We're getting a priority message right now from Deck 10, Section 10. Better be important, Rick sighed, and brought the signal onto the large screen. It only took 10 of the 30 minutes Colonel Alexei had granted. All is in position, Jehoiakim announced. Rick took a deep breath. Go. Receiving the word, the ag specialist finished twisting the large wrench. The end of the bulk tank came off. Nearby, 2 other ag workers manipulated the control panel attached to the tank, and the flow reversed. Large quantities of milk poured out onto the floor of the chamber. The other bovine, safely secured behind the clear wall of the next chamber, Blanche steadied herself. She was the only one strong enough to pull this off. With so many of the ship's systems down, it had to be manual. Slowly and steadily, the milk stopped pouring out of the tank, and it was followed by the backwash of the green gel. The green gel poured out. As soon as she caught sight of the green, it was time. Blanche ran at high speed and braced herself for ramming. As she charged, the ag workers all fled into the clear-walled, secure chamber. Blanche collided with the patch covering the hole in the hull left by the chimp invading ship. She collided hard, and it tore away from the ship. At that same instant, she was blown out into the void of space. One of the travel pods was moved, still open, into a position to catch her, quickly returning her to the ship near the medical facility. Doctors were waiting to try to save her. As the pod enclosed around her and zipped away, the command deck personnel took remote control of the gel, and it poured out of the puncture in the hull. It began to cover the ship without the vents. On the Soviet vessel, it all happened too quickly for a response. They had barely detected the travel pod in motion and the hatch blowing away when they saw the gel pouring around the hull of Liberty. "Attack! Attack!" Colonel Alexei cried out to his chimp crew. On Liberty, Yehoiakim called out, "It worked!" Jin's fingers danced across the operations panel. "The gel is moving too slowly this way. I'm turning the ship so the covered portion of the hull faces the enemy." "Do it," Rick confirmed. "Then land a few punches on that garbage scow." The rubbery yet firm texture of the gel simply detected the impact of the Soviet attack. The great boulders made a glancing bounce and flew off into the void. Then a large portion of the gel stretched rapidly into increasingly rectangular shape, and it smashed its flat end into the Soviet vessel, as if the Liberty had literally punched the enemy twice, and it tremored and began to drift backwards and sideways away. "Signal the Soviets we await their surrender," Rick instructed. The signal was never sent, as Emerson interjected, "There's another ship coming in, one of ours." Before Rick could inquire, M went on, "It's the Preservation, but their cyber signature reads, His Majesty's Ship Preservation." Rick's eyes grew large. "The Emperor. The Emperor is here." Chapter 10. The Emperor. Rick had only seen this happen once before in his lifetime, and it was the only time since the treaties were signed and the constitution that formed the solar convergence. The Emperor had been the one who had let the majority of humans go their own way and live in the license zone. The Emperor had been the one who took control during the great crisis of the rebellion. The Emperor. It was the right decision, of course. It was part of their body politic because it was a Pux tradition. The ancient Pux had been ruled by an emperor. At some point in their history, they had developed this incredibly, democratic system, for lack of a better word, by which they constantly consulted one another through the vibrations they sent, their own version of the internet under the soil. All things were discussed and voted upon beforehand, but they had retained this odd tradition. The rapidity with which the Pux could gain virtual consensus was legendary, but they had maintained the imperial family and its traditions and bloodlines. Each legitimate heir had to be trained and educated. They spent their lives on call or standby. If there was any crisis great enough to need an individual leadership, immediate responses, the Pux would quickly vest this authority in their emperor and activate him for a period of time. He was essentially the absolute ruler of the Pux for a brief period, and they would not enter into the solar convergence treaties or constitution without it, which meant now the Articles of Union which formed the convergence respected the practice, and if vested, the emperor of the Pux became the absolute temporary ruler of the solar convergence. Now suddenly one of the large screens on Liberty's command deck shimmered with the gold and purple metallic armor of the Emperor, the only Pux known to never use a puppet or communicate or act out through one. The Emperor's special armor incorporated the technology of the Fred device. It was also stuffed inside with dirt to keep him comfortable and translated their vibratory underground language into audible words. "Wow, he's small," Emerson couldn't help but say. She had never seen a Pux other than through the puppet. She blushed. She hadn't been living outside the license zone long enough. The Emperor was small, all right, smaller than Rick remembered. Maybe they'd changed the armor. Maybe this wasn't even the same Emperor Rick had met once. Their whole life was deeply buried in secrecy and Pux ceremony and ritual. Respectful secrecy and historic admiration was the way of the Pux. The emperors didn't even have names, just the title, roughly translated into Anglo, for human consumption that fit their title. Without muttering a single word, the Emperor waved his hand and the screen became split. Colonel Alexei appeared. Truce. The voice of the Emperor was perfect. Not too deep, not too high. He always sounded both commanding and humble at the same time. We are coming aboard your ship, Comrade Colonel. We need to talk. Now at a disadvantage, Alexei couldn't disagree. He started to open his mouth anyway. The Emperor held open his hand in a strangely assuring gesture. We come unarmed, only in peace. The screen flickered off. Rick's personal Fred signaled to him from his forearm. You and Taj disarm, and the Emperor and I will pick you up. The text signal was signed First Secretary Regan. She was here too. Regan's fingers moved her red hair out of her eyes. Taj, disarmed like the others, was still studying the landing bay tactically and ready for an old-fashioned martial arts style fight should talks break down. Rick tried to look calm and confident. The Emperor succeeded in being both. Surrounded by several of his chimps, Colonel Alexei managed an arrogant expression and simply waited. What seemed like a very long silence indeed was finally broken by the Pux Emperor. Nice furnace you have there. In every corner of the bay there was, indeed, a furnace of sorts, and a few chimp corpses on the floor beside it. The Emperor leaned toward Rick. They use an older form of the vortex drive. It shifts them interdimensionally. Works well for mechanisms not so good for biological life. The Emperor stared down Colonel Alexei politely. Hope you are well, Comrade Colonel. I volunteered for this duty, Alexei explained. The chimp-human hybrids are raw material, quite disposable. The chimps around the bay hung their heads slightly and looked around at each other. I am Hybrid 1172, the blue-eyed chimp who had boarded Liberty spoke up. This little thing is your tyrant? He is elected by the people for only a crisis and a short period of time, Regan explained. We have no tyrants in the solar convergence. Remembering the Emperor's instructions on the brief trip over, Rick chimed in. We believe in freedom and everyone making their own choices. Information. That had been the Emperor's orders. Give them as much information about us as possible. No one is raw material to us, Taj proclaimed. Even the cows you saw on Liberty are free and treated as equals. Colonel Alexei fidgeted and commanded, Stop talking to them, 1172. Shut up. In return for a promise of peace, we will let you keep the technology you've stolen, the Emperor inserted. We consider it less important than any living being. But we will learn to use it against you, 1172 was aghast. The Soviets will conquer you. Regan barely let him finish the sentence. Our values require us to face that when and if the time comes. Perhaps you will all think about that in the meantime. Colonel Alexei touched a few buttons on a small controller he was holding, and 1172 and the other chimps in the bay were all given a slight shock. I said stop talking. Then Alexei directed his enmity to the Convergence representatives. We have learned enough already to know the truth about you. You have left the majority of humanity living in their own depravity, while you live lives rich and full and fat, full of technological assistance. You prefer the good of alien creatures above the good of the whole of humanity. You even take orders from this thane in a depraved hierarchy of power. How sad to have rediscovered our home world to find that the problems have not been fixed and that the proletariat continues to be dominated by your bourgeoisie tyranny. Your opinions are yours, the Emperor waved his hand, and you are free to keep them. We will go now, even without any promises from you then, even as your convoluted ideology makes clear that your word would mean nothing anyway. Colonel Alexei's face grew red with anger as the Emperor went on. But know this, we are not fools. We will be watching you and what you do from here. Alexei pushed some buttons on his small controller again, and the whole ship suddenly shook. Everyone in the bay fell to the ground and then struggled back upwards. He has dimensionally shifted the ship, Regan pointed out. Back on his feet, the Emperor helped Rick and Taj up. No doubt you think you have made us your prisoner, he observed. The loss of us four will make no difference in the universe, in the scheme of things. The calm of the Emperor's voice infuriated Alexei all the more. We're headed to the Soviet homeworld, Soyuz. And you should be afraid. You should be afraid of what's going to happen to you and when we come to liberate Earth. Suddenly and without warning, Chimp 1172 grabbed Alexei's arm and swiftly tore it off his body. Alexei screamed. Without his control panel in that hand, he could not punish the chimps. They swiftly tore off his other limbs and his head and left them in a pile. Blood splattered everywhere, even on the Emperor, who showed no signs of flinching, even as the Terrans with him stepped back and gasped in horror at the scene. 1172 was busy playing with the control pad Alexei had once handled, muttering to himself about revolution. He was clearly sending out messages. We didn't come here to promote bloodshed, the Emperor declared. 1172 looked up and squinted his blue eyes. Screams began emanating through the ship. Human screams. Then the ship shifted again, and they all fell to the deck. We have rejoined your vessels near Samoranai, 1172 confirmed, and soon there will be no more Soviets on Soyuz. Not the cleanest road to freedom, the Emperor pointed out, but that is also your choice. We will return the bodies of your dead to you and the technology that was stolen, 1172 offered, if you will allow us to keep the planet Soyuz. It's yours, the Emperor assured. Use this freedom wisely. Find your own destiny with patience, and I hope we can be friends. Regan offered. After all, you are hybrids, so you are also our cousins. Chapter 11. Sometime later. The Emperor is safely back in the soil of Puxaswitney, First Secretary Regan explained. The gel had more trouble repairing the minor damage you had from two-dimensional shifts that the Soviets put us through, but you're going to be fine. Rick wiped the sweat off his forehead as he stared at the ceiling of the hospital room. Liberty? Repairs are well underway, Emerson reported, then hesitated. Last night, well, it had been too long, so we had the farewell dinner for Blanche. Rick sighed. I'm sad she didn't make it. Too much damage, even being in space so briefly, Yehoiakim observed. She gave her life in the performance of her duty. In accordance with cow custom, we consumed her, Regan confirmed. Been a long time since I had beef. It was true, Rick sighed. Since learning that bovines are intelligent, Terrans no longer butchered them. Yet so important was their communion and symbiosis with humanity to them that the cows actually insisted that their meat be harvested and eaten whenever possible when they died naturally. I'm sure it was a beautiful ceremony, Rick managed to smile. Could I have a moment alone with Regan? The others filed out with smiles and shoulder pats of assurance and friendship. First Secretary Regan's green eyes shimmered with expectation. You're wondering what happened. How did the Emperor know so much about them? Rick shook his head. How did he know the chimps would revolt and turn the tide? He didn't know for sure, Regan explained. We were really prepared just to go see them face to face the threat sooner rather than later, and to accept the risk, even the risk of trying to live in peace with them. Rick simply nodded as she went on. As to the first question, pausing as she stepped over to a Fred screen on the wall, Regan danced her fingers across it, bringing up a picture of the spatial anomaly that connected the two halves of Bryn Gustafsson Station. When we tried to stabilize this anomaly, we had unexpected energy readings interfere. That's why it ended up so small. Rick looked confused. Regan simply went on. When we got the initial data stream about the ship attacking the snow and searched all the relevant data, this old issue popped up on the computer. Rick was even more confused. Well, the energy signature of the Soviet ship was almost identical to the one that threw off the anomaly, so we checked the historical records further. Apparently, Nazi scientists experimented with a vortex drive during the Second World War. The Soviets used captured Nazi scientists after the war to build one. It was unstable and didn't just dimensionally shift, but shifted through time as well as space. Their ship, including the chimpanzees for experimentation, the scientists, and some soldiers, took off in 1947, slipped through the spatial anomaly we were building far in the future from them, and dropped out on the other side of the galaxy, but back in 1947. They found a habitable planet somehow, and the rest is history. Rick sighed and leaned his head back. There's a planet where the Soviet Union continued to exist. I have a headache.